Hey everyone, and welcome on in. We typically start these webinars, if this is your first time joining us, a minute or two after the posted start time, just to give everyone a minute to filter in. You know how it goes with these kinds of things when your phone buzzes and then you open up Zoom only to realize that you haven't been on it in a month and you need to update it. So we give people a little grace to rush to their devices and get here. So we'll get started probably around 7:01, 7:02. Alyssa, how's it going?
We're doing all right. That last big push before early action and early decision deadline. So it's really exciting right now.
Yeah, we have mostly junior and sophomore and younger families with us today. But just so you know, for future years, this will be a very busy time in the fall of senior year, especially if your student ends up applying for any of those early action or early decision deadlines that end up around November 1st. This is probably also a good opportunity to shamelessly plug an upcoming webinar we have on the college admissions calendar. So, one of our upcoming webinars, we'll post the schedule in the chat here for the rest of the webinars for the year, but it'll cover sort of the college admissions calendar broadly, including, concerns for each grade and including deadlines for applications and when students need to think about different things in the process. So it'll be a nice way to kind of check in on what you should be doing when, especially for you younger students. There's not too much to be focused on in the short term, but it's a great way to just kind of get your bearings.
Yes. And on that note, any juniors who are in attendance, please just bear with your upperclassmen friends just a little bit longer. They'll all be able to exhale in like the next week or two, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. With our students, we really, really, really try to make sure they're not working right up to the deadline. The whole point of,
Hmm.
working with someone like us is that we can be organized and on top of it and make sure we get things done well in advance. At the same time, sometimes people change where they want to apply early decision at sort of the 11th hour, and then there'll always be a few students who have to work up to crunch time.
Yeah, or they visit a school in the fall when it's beautiful out and go, oh no, I actually don't mind the cold that much. Let's go northeast. You go, yeah,
Yeah,
you got your work done ahead of time, so we do have time to do those extra set of essays. Let's go.
exactly. And in if you've been in the Philly area, the month of October so far has been incredible.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, I feel like last year we had like 1 week of fall and it went from like rainy to cold with one
Hmm.
nice week in the middle. It's been nice to have a sustained period of good weather.
Yeah. And not so
Uh,
windy that you don't have like the pretty fall like leaves off the trees in like 2 days.
exactly. All right. So we'll jump into it now. Welcome on in, everyone, to our webinar, What Do You Do When Everyone Has an A? My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. I see from our attendee list here that many of you already know and have spoken to me. I speak with many of our new families about whatever they're interested here at Ivy Experience, but I specifically oversee all of our test prep. So I work with families on plans for when to take the test, whether to pick the SAT or ACT, how to structure prep, and things like that. I'm joined by Alyssa Coltrane, our director of college admissions, who you might have gathered focuses with students on applying to college, drafting and revising essays, packaging themselves as an applicant. And we're here today because my expertise is more on the academic side of things, and Alyssa's expertise is more on the sort of holistic side of admissions to talk about the sort of modern high school environment where many students are getting very strong grades and what students can do to try to separate themselves from a college admissions standpoint given that situation. So, the very first thing to note here, and if you've been in our previous webinars of any kind, we often touch on this because it's a very important thing to understand when we're talking about the modern college admissions environment. It's grade inflation. And so, what we have here is a graph showing the percentage of college freshmen at four-year universities who have at least a 90% equivalent GPA from high school. So I'm going to be referring to that as at least a 90% equivalent. Some schools use a 3.0 scale for their GPAs. Some schools use a GPA out of 100 and it's kind of based on percentages. Some schools use a 5-point GPA. Every school's GPA calculation is a little different. And so I'm going to be using 90% to mean essentially an A minus average. So students with at least an A minus average now make up 85.8% of college freshmen. And so it's not true that everyone has an A. It is true that the vast majority of college freshmen do. And that becomes more true when you look at more selective colleges, which is typically what people come to us with an interest in. And so that is kind of where the somewhat cryptic topic of this webinar comes from. Now, when we talk about this grade inflation, we have to compare with the data from the college side of things as well. So I have here data from the University of Pittsburgh. This is a popular school with our Philadelphia area students because it's one of Pennsylvania's flagship state schools, along with Penn State. And at the University of Pittsburgh, for their most recently published data about their freshman class, which is to say last school year's freshman class, 67% of those freshmen at Pitt had over a 4.0 GPA in high school. Now, Pitt uses a weighted GPA. Whenever you're looking at this kind of data for a college, you have to check if that college asks for a weighted or unweighted GPA. If a college uses an unweighted GPA, it shouldn't really get over 4.0. But Pitt, they use a weighted GPA, which is to say they give some extra credit for honors and AP courses. And so their actual average GPA is a 4.13. And this is surprising to a lot of people that a state school would have, over what is typically considered a perfect GPA. Of course, you can have a 4.13 depending on how many honors and APs you take, even with some, Bs and A minuses mixed in. But this is all to just really hammer the point home, especially for parents, for whom, again, if we go back to our previous slide, parents, in your generation, depending on kind of where exactly you were in high school, we're talking about, grades being essentially half-ish as many students having an A average. And so grades when you were in school just meant something very different than grades mean now. And it's really important to understand that for the rest of this conversation. Grade inflation is a sort of multifactorial problem. It's not just that, kids are lazy now. It's not that teachers are too easy. It's not that parents are too demanding of what the schools do. It's a constellation of factors. And really what grade inflation is a cultural practice. And our culture has decided that a different level of work deserves an A now than what our culture had believed deserved an A during your generation in high school. So that's just a really important thing to consider here. The other really important thing to consider here is that, it'd be nice if we could believe that grades are just getting that much better because kids are getting that much smarter. And certainly we work with some absolutely brilliant students every year. And sometimes it just does feel like the kids are getting smarter and smarter. And maybe there's an element of that. But we have some metrics that haven't changed over the years that hold quite steady. And what we're showing you here is the average ACT score nationwide year over year. This average ACT score, the reason we use ACT and not SAT here is because SAT has redesigned its test and its scoring scale a few times, starting in the 90s and several times since then, whereas ACT's overall scoring system hasn't really changed. So when we compare from 1990 to 2022, we are comparing apples to apples from an ACT standpoint. The ACT is changing soon, but this gives us the best historical data that we can hope for. And you can see that the scores on standardized tests like the ACT, they haven't really changed very much over this same time period. And so the ACT remains a measure that is consistent year to year, where grades mean something different now than they meant 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. If we zoom in on that ACT trend, this is the same data, but zoomed in and including a few of the more recent years, we can actually see that, over virtual school and the COVID pandemic, we've seen a dip in ACT scores. And this is something that anyone in the test prep world who's worked with many students over the past few years can tell you is obvious and observable. We work with students who have an A in pre-calculus and struggle with percentages or fractions or, some more fundamental building block of math that they were supposed to have learned along the way, but was covered during virtual school and therefore not quite as effectively for them. Teachers were forced to a model that they weren't adequately prepared for, and they made the best of the situation. Everyone tried to make the best of the situation, but when you're a teacher and you've taught math the same way for 20 years and you're asked to completely reinvent the wheel on a dime, uh, it's going to lead to a less effective instruction, right? So we see throughout the more recent years that test scores have actually started to trail downward, even while grades are experiencing an unprecedented spike upward. So the question is essentially, how would an admissions office view this kind of thing? And for that, I'll hand it over to Alyssa.
Yes. And in a sense, we're going to play a little bit of a hypothetical here. You are an admissions officer and you have, the files of two students in front of you. And, there are two somewhat imaginary things here. First, unless you're Georgetown University, you are not actually reading these files on paper. You are reading them on a computer. And also, admissions officers do not truly compare students in this kind of head-to-head fashion that we're about to talk you through. But for the purposes of tonight, this is going to be our thought experiment. So you have the files of two students in front of you. Grades are going to be the most important factor in an admissions decision. So the first thing that you go to look at is the grades of the students that you're looking at. You want to evaluate the students fairly in their context or thinking about the high school that they go to. And you have two students who've attended a reasonably well-reputed public high school in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area. You know that, transitioning into high school can be a little bit rocky sometimes. There's a B or so scattered in that freshman year, but there's that upward trajectory as the students grow and develop and find their footing in their high school, in their high school. All of this is fairly promising, but at the same time, you are seeing two very similar stories. So at that moment, and this is fundamentally what the drive of the rest of the presentation is going to be, when you are in that situation, how do you choose who to accept to a college or university when you are looking at, a suite of candidates where 85.8% of them have an A? And Jim, I think you were going to talk us through the first of the answers, right?
That's right. So grades are one piece of the puzzle when it comes to your academic performance. Academic rigor is another. And so academic rigor is a way that students can distinguish themselves in this process. Essentially, what that means is taking more challenging courses. Now, we're not necessarily going to sit here and say that every single person in this presentation should take the very most challenging courses that their school offers just to impress colleges. In life, everything is about balance, right? And you have to balance being able to challenge yourself and build a strong foundation for a college application with your ability to thrive and succeed. But this is what colleges are going to be thinking about and looking for. They're going to look at the level of your courses. Often that's going to mean honors courses, AP or IB courses where your school offers them, and dual enrollment courses taken. And colleges are especially impressed with dual enrollment courses taken as college courses. They tend to be less impressed by dual enrollment courses that are offered at the high school than a dual enrollment course that a high school student takes among college students. So that is a distinction I want to call out. They're also going to look for 4 years of the same foreign language. In a perfect world, the 4 years of the same foreign language is not an explicit requirement at most 4-year universities. Typically, they'll ask for two, but even the colleges that ask for two would prefer to see four when we're talking about a strong record of academic rigor. The other thing to consider here in particular is what your top math level will be based on the math track that you are on as early as freshman year or wherever you are in high school right now. And what we mean by that is particularly if you're looking to go into a STEM heavy field, like for example, engineering, colleges are going to want you to have taken calculus by senior year of high school. And so if engineering, is going to be your focus and the thing that you're interested in, then you might want to consider taking a summer course if that's what it's going to take to make sure that you're able to progress to calculus by your senior year, because that's going to make a big difference when applying to engineering schools. With essentially what you'd be doing is taking a level of math over the summer. And if this is something you're considering, sooner is typically better. And what I mean by that is, to put it very plainly, it's a lot easier to take Algebra 2 over the summer than it is to take pre-calculus over the summer. It's easier to take Algebra 1 over the summer than Algebra 2. It's easier to take geometry than pre-calculus over the summer. So the higher up that math class is, the harder it's going to be to fit into that summer context and really learn it well enough to set yourself up to succeed in the math class that's coming. So that's something to really consider if you are a STEM focused student. Um, I do just want to make sure that everyone knows, again, we're not saying everyone needs to always go for the most difficult course. A way that we like to frame the decision for, should I go to the next level up in a course, is first of all, a great thing to do, students, is talk to any of your older friends who might be in that course. Ask them, hey, how many hours a week are you actually spending on this thing? Right? So that you can get a sense of how many hours a week the difference is going to be between the next level and that. The other thing to consider is, what effect that's going to have on the rest of what you have going on. And what I mean by that is that it's good to take an honors course if it challenges you. And it's totally okay to take an honors course that's going to be your hardest course, even if it's your hardest course by far. That's an okay thing to do. And it can be a really great learning and growing experience, even aside from the impact it has on your college applications. But if taking that next level up is such a burden that it causes you to suffer in your other classes because of the amount of time that you have to put in AP chemistry or whatever that course is, or if you're not able to devote yourself in the same way to the extracurricular activities that you care about, and that also will matter in this process, more on that from Alyssa in a little bit, then that's when you consider pulling back, because you do have to perform well in many things. And if, extending that performance in one area is going to hurt your performance in so many other areas, that's really the point at which you consider, okay, maybe I should stick to the next level down. But I really advise talking to some of your older friends who are in those challenging courses to get a sense of how much more work is this really going to be, because that's going to be your best source of information for that. You can talk to us about it, but we may or may not have spoken with a student who's had that teacher for that course before. Your friends at school absolutely have, and who has had that teacher. This brings me to answer two. And answer two is a very interesting question. One, because I'm a massive standardized testing nerd, which all of you who've ever spoken to me on the phone probably know. But two, because one of the most common comments that I get from parents is a parent who calls me and says, my student is an A-B student, mostly A's, a couple B's. And, they scored this score on the SAT. Why is it so out of line with their grades? Why is the SAT score so out of line with their grades? And the truth is that when we consider that an A minus average makes you top, we'll call it 86% of high school students, what that means in standardized testing terms is that you just scored in the 14th percentile. And the 14th percentile SAT score is 800. And the 14th percentile ACT score is 13. So if your average grade is an A minus, then what that really means is that you would expect to be around that 14th percentile test score for your percentile from a grade standpoint and from a standardized testing standpoint to be equivalent, meaning when you compared to the rest of your classmates. So I say that not to discourage anyone, but just to give people a sense, when we look at some of these averages, average test scores at colleges, they are almost all inflated. The only places they're not inflated are at the few schools out there that are still requiring test scores from all applicants. Because when a college is test optional, guess who doesn't submit the test scores? The students with the lowest test scores. And that means it pushes the averages up. So if you look at a school where, say about 50% of the students submit standardized test scores, Pitt would be in this boat. They're between kind of 40 and 60% submitting test scores every year. Well, that really what you're looking at is the average of the top half of their standardized test scores, because the bottom half of the standardized test scores are not coming through anymore. So colleges' averages are inflated relative to reality, and that's something to consider. Now, a standardized test score is a way to either confirm or strengthen your academic record. And so if we return to our thought experiment, if you and another student have a very similar academic transcript, but you submit a strong standardized test score and that other student does not submit a standardized test score, whose grades is the college going to believe more in that case? If standardized testing has always existed, partially as a means to confirm a student's academic record, it still does that now. And so submitting a standardized test score that is going to be a positive on your application, which can vary based on what your grades are, what your test score is, and what schools you're applying to. And I highly recommend, by the way, that you watch the replay of our test optional webinar that we gave recently. The same link that we posted to our fall webinar schedule has the link to that recording on YouTube. But submitting a test score that will confirm that academic record is a way for a college to be more confident that your grades tell a story that they want to hear than the academic record of a student who doesn't submit a test score with the same transcript. Now, it's not just me who's saying this. You might think, well, aren't you biased? You're the standardized testing guy. I'll freely admit, yes, I am. Obviously, I have a horse in the race. But the public narrative around standardized testing in college admissions has totally shifted over the last year. We've seen articles in the New York Times and other national publications about the misguided war on the SAT. We have admissions professionals from very well-known and well-reputed universities that are coming out, such as the Dean of Emory, saying, we're not as trusting of GPA these days. Grades are definitely inflated. The context of that quote is he saying Emory's actually focusing more on AP scores than they ever have before in their admissions process, because the AP score gives external validation of what those grades mean. It's very easy to get the AP label on your course as a high school teacher, but if you can actually prove that the third party validated standardized test, I passed it in a meaningful way, that's another way to confirm your academic record and show that, yeah, my A in AP chemistry also led to a 5 on the exam. That means I learned it at a high level. We have the president of Brown saying that standardized tests are a much better predictor of academic success than high school grades, which wasn't always the case. In fact, for most of the history of education statistics in the United States, high school GPA was the best predictor of a student's college GPA. We can see with the data I provided from the New York Times here that the SAT or ACT has become a stronger predictor of a student's college GPA than their high school GPA has been. Why is that? When we talk about grade inflation, what we're also talking about is grade compression. And what I mean by that is that GPAs are closer together than ever. There are fewer of the lowest GPAs, fewer spread out toward the low end of the scale. When all of the GPAs are clustered toward the top, it means that the minute differences between, say, a 3.89 and a 3.91, I mean, that doesn't really mean nearly as much as when, that same difference would have been represented by 3.6 and 3.9 20, 30 years ago. So with grade compression, it means that colleges can rely on these grades less than ever because students' grades are more similar than ever. And then I think we'll move on from this slide at that point. But if you have any more questions about standardized testing, I always have to hold myself back from just blabbing endlessly about it. Alyssa's nodding because many company meetings, she's had to endure this kind of thing before. But we'll move on and let Alyssa tell us about something a little more fun, extracurricular activities.
Yes, and one of the things that we are going to be highlighting for the rest of this, of our time together is moving into those more qualitative factors. So we've had a chance to talk about grades, rigor, SAT or ACT scores. These are things that our admissions officers are going to see in some ways in black and white. You have a 3.5 or a 3.75. You have a 1450 or a 1550 on the SAT. Our remaining components are going to be more qualitative. And these are the moments where admissions officers start to be able to see an applicant, not just as a student, but as a person, and begin to be able to see who will this person be on my campus, beyond just who will this person be in the classroom. And one of the first ways to do that is extracurriculars. Is the student going to be someone who is engaged on my campus, who is getting involved, who is making this campus a more exciting, more interesting place to be? Or are they going to get straight A's and then go home, go back to their dorm and be on TikTok all day? Colleges look to extracurriculars to see that students are productive and engaging their interests in a thoughtful and authentic way. And one of the first things I want to say here is that idea of thoughtful and authentic is true. There is not a checklist. There is not a specific set of extracurriculars that admissions officers are expecting students you know, to invest in. That is going to vary by student, and by their interests. And that is something that it may lead to, and this is something that I'll talk about on the next slide, of a student that might be a little pointy, a student who is really into their athletics. And it might be that many of their extracurriculars connect to this, that they run for the track team, but they also volunteer at one of the summer camps that gets students running, or for organizations that gather up and donate lightly used sneakers. It may be that, I don't know, maybe they have a podcast where they follow ultra marathoners and chronicle what that is like. It is all right to be pointy, and it is also all right to be well-rounded. What matters here is authenticity. And that can be a range of things. It can be intellectual pursuits. It can be civic engagement. It can be a personal interest or curiosity. But one of the things that becomes sometimes difficult is to pursue an interest authentically. In some ways, it can be easy to go, all right, I'm going to go to the club fair and I'm going to sign up for a volunteer thing, and I'm going to sign up for the club in my foreign language, and I'm going to sign up for this, because this way I've just checked all of the boxes. But authenticity requires thinking deeply and reflecting. If, we have a student who is really passionate about running, it's a lot harder to start the podcast about chronicling your journey to become an ultra marathoner than it might be to sign up for another club. For a student who is interested in a STEM field, it might be more difficult to cold email professors to see if there is a research opportunity than, adding in another event to Science Olympiad. So ideally, these activities are both authentic to the student, but they also allow the admissions officer to get a sense of who they are. And hopefully, if they're authentic, this is something that the student is going to enjoy doing, because many of these are ideally done for a student's own personal fulfillment, as well as, checking off a box on a resume or the Common App.
So this brings us to a qualitative factor that is academic in nature, but qualitative in effect. And that is the letter of recommendation, or I should say, letters of recommendation. What they do is they offer third-party insights into a student directly from an adult who's worked closely with them. So what they can do is show who a student is as a worker, as a classmate, as a contributor in class discussion, as a person and a human being, if teachers are observing acts of kindness or generosity from a student. Now, You typically want to ask 1 to 2 junior year core subject teachers, and you'll be required to have a recommendation from your counselor at school. When it comes to selecting those 1 to 2 subject teachers, I should mention there's no requirement that they're junior year teachers, and it's not an explicit requirement that they're core subject teachers. Core subject, by the way, we mean English, math, social studies, science, and foreign language. Now, with these teachers that you're asking, you do not just want to ask the teacher in whose class you performed the best. You might ask that teacher, but the reason cannot be your performance. And I say that, or rather, it can't be that you just got an excellent grade in the class. Because if you got an excellent grade in the class, the college already knows that. It's on your transcript. A plus AP English. You killed it. Great job. If all your AP English teacher is going to say is like, wow, what a great writer, what a great student, it already says it right there. It says A plus. You know, they know you're a great writer. It's an AP English class and you got an A plus. So what you want to find is a teacher who really can speak to who you are, a teacher who knows you best and loves you best. You want a teacher with whom you've built a relationship. Often this means picking a teacher in a course you've really struggled with. Maybe math has always been a struggle for you and you've gone to this teacher before school, during lunch, after school for extra help. You spend more time one-on-one with this teacher than any other teacher. And regardless of the outcome in the class, maybe scratching and clawing, you were only able to bring it to a B plus because math is just not your thing. But that teacher saw you show up day in and day out and stick with it, even though it was hard for you, and work your tail off to keep your head above water. That's a teacher who's likely to write you a very strong letter of recommendation that can speak to some of these ineffable qualities that we're not going to find with a letter and a plus or minus symbol on a transcript. So you really want to think about who you're asking and who can add an insight that will speak to who you are as a person. They might also speak about your performance in the class. Maybe you were just like excellent in class discussion, right? And your teacher, you could tell you really appreciated the points that you brought to bear in class discussions. That kind of thing doesn't necessarily show up in a grade because if it just shows that you did enough to get an A in class discussion, not that you were totally excellent at it. So that's the kind of thing to think about. There can be exceptions for which teachers to ask for these letters of recommendation. I mentioned we typically want junior year core subject teachers. Core subject teachers because they want people who've worked with you in similar academic areas to what you're going to study in college. And junior year teachers because the junior year version of a student is much more similar to the college freshman than the high school freshman or sophomore version of that student. So they're going to get a better picture of the student who's going to show up on campus junior year than they would from an earlier year. Now, that said, if you took, for instance, AP chemistry your sophomore year and you want to be a chemical engineer and chemistry is really important to you and you had an incredible relationship with your chemistry teacher, it's okay to ask your chemistry teacher, even though you were a sophomore. It can be okay to ask a freshman year teacher. It's a bit of a rarer situation, but I did actually ask a freshman year teacher, and my reason was twofold. One was that he was my world history teacher. One of the things I wanted to study was classics, which is the study of ancient Greece and Rome, and that's something we covered in that class. Two is that he was my head track and field coach in high school. Now, I was the captain of the track and field team the spring of my senior year. You don't get credit in college admissions for things that you do in the spring of your senior year. It's an unfortunate truth. And I was a late bloomer physically in high school. So I was JV for 3 years. So all it said in the activity section of my Common App was track and field JV, track and field JV, track and field JV, right? Nothing to show for it. And it looks like I was just someone who showed up and, punched the clock, checked my box, as Alyssa said earlier, for well-roundedness and went home. The truth is I was really dedicated to track and field and I was a leader on the team in the sense that, I would help the coach set up for meets. I ran our fully automatic timing system at invitationals, and I was trusted with a lot of responsibilities that other students on the team were not. So this coach that I worked really closely with was able to speak to the fact that my main extracurricular activity, for which I had no paper accolades, was something I was really dedicating myself to and really growing from. And at the same time, he was a relevant subject teacher of mine from freshman year. So when you have that very strong relationship where that recommender could do something for my college application that no other teacher I possibly could have asked could do, that's when you consider asking a teacher from an earlier year of high school, when you have that special relationship or special circumstance. And by the way, very important reminder, especially for you juniors, ask before the end of the year. You don't have to know in October who you're going to ask for letters of recommendation. You get a whole year to decide. Don't rush it. But May and June, you shouldn't leave school on the last day of school without asking. And that's because many teachers, they cap the number of letters of recommendation that they'll write. Teachers do this out of the goodness of their heart on their own time. They are not paid to write letters of recommendation. They are well within their rights and well within their contract to say no to every student who asks. They do it because they want to, and they are people who like to get these things done over the summer when they're not so busy during the school year. So if you ask a teacher in the spring, then you're being courteous to them, you're giving them plenty of time. And remember, they're writing a letter that is a subjective impression of you. So the better of an impression you can give them in the whole way you handle this interaction, the better that letter is likely to turn out. So be very polite and, understanding of the fact that this is totally voluntary for them, and make sure you give them plenty of notice, and make sure you're picking the right teachers.
So we've saved, as far as I'm concerned, the best for last. The essays and applications, in many ways, are the ultimate distinguishing factor on a college application. It is entirely possible to have a similar transcript, to have a similar rigor, to have a similar SAT score, to even have similar extracurriculars. But ideally, an essay that is written correctly shows who the student is as a person. We often refer to them as the heart and soul of the application. Those are the moments that are going to show the student in their most distinct and personal self. And that is what the best essays, especially the personal statement, are intended to do. They are not always the best well written. And, this can be a moment of relief for any of our students here who are anxious about, well, I'm not a very good writer. The best essays are not the most well written. They are the most personal and personally insightful. Even Duke came out and said they do not consider, when they are reading the personal statement and the supplements, they do not consider these essays as a method of assessing the student's ability to write. They look to other factors in the application for that. They look for grades in English class. They look for, the verbal or English and reading sections of the SAT or ACT. They aren't looking to the essays for those. What they are looking to the essays for is an example of the student's values and the student's character. And that is why ultimately, for those essays, that's going to be the most decisive and distinguishing factor. So now that I have raised the stakes on the essays sufficiently, how do you write an essay that is distinct and personal and thoughtful? And that fundamentally is going to be brainstorming. In that case, that is where, when we work with students, we start with a very broad couch, a very broad remit. What do we need to know about you? And everything is fair game for a student essay if it is able to be personal and insightful to the student. We've had students write about their favorite color being pink. We've had students write about their kid sister stealing their socks. We've had students write about the fact that soccer is played without timeouts. It can be almost anything when it reveals something about who the student is. The soccer essay became a moment of meditation on learning to trust yourself. When you're playing without timeouts, you cannot run over to your coach and go, hey, what do I need to do? You have to trust yourself, you have to trust your team, and you have to act. And that was what the student wanted to convey in that moment. And that is why we ask students to unpack why things are meaningful, to focus on experiences rather than just adjectives. It would be very easy for me, for instance, to sit here and go, I know a lot about sports. And Jim is probably cackling over there because he knows I don't. It would be a
Unless
lot,
it's hockey.
unless it's hockey, yes. But it would be more difficult for me to come up with, specific details or specific memories associated with them. So as we start to brainstorm, we think about specific examples and anecdotes, and we cast a wide net so that students can highlight truly what is essential to them. And it may not be, an activity. It might be that your kid sister steals your socks. It may be that the color, your favorite color is pink or orange. But the best essays are the ones that show sort of what is crucial to a student and who they're going to be on a college campus, because that is ultimately, to bring it back to our admissions officer, what they are looking for when they go to admit students is they are going, what is the community that I want to live and work within? Who do I want to be a part of my campus community?
All right, so we're going to ask everyone to drop their questions in the Q&A. We've got a couple in there already. But before we do, we just wanted to kind of end with some quick notes, kind of grade by grade, for what students should be focused on
Right now.
in the short term. Right. So we'll start with if we have any freshman students or younger in here. The main thing is to explore extracurricular activities. Find what you want to spend your time on that's going to be personally rewarding and engaging for you. And those are the things that will end up kind of coming back to pay you back in the college admissions process. So that also means finding what activities you don't want to continue to pursue. You know, just because you've been doing something for a few years, if it doesn't bring you joy, you're going to be very busy in high school. You have to make priorities. So consider kind of where you want to spend that time. For 10th graders, this is a time to continue to refine those activities and also to start to think ahead to next year about standardized testing. You won't necessarily be taking standardized testing in 10th grade, but most of our students in 10th grade will be doing some kind of diagnostic testing to determine whether SAT or ACT is a better fit for them. We actually have a webinar on the PSAT next Thursday, a week from today. I'll be back here with our colleague Tori Burke to talk about how to make that kind of plan. So stay tuned for that. And then for you juniors, you have the most immediately on your plate, of course, because junior year is where it all goes down. If you don't have your testing plan yet, make sure you get it down. If you do have your testing plan, continue to work away at that. You really want to work on building depth with your extracurricular activities. So it's not so much about trying new things. If you find something new that you want to try, you absolutely should. We're not telling you not to. But it's about trying to find that depth. To use a school club example, it's not just, do I want to join a new club, but of the organizations I'm involved with, is there anywhere I could see myself running for an office, treasurer of the club, or something like that?
Or in
And
a
then,
more informal way, is there a project that I could spearhead for that particular club? Even, we know that there's only a finite number of presidents of clubs in a high school, but is there a project that I could take on specifically for this club that is near and dear to my heart?
yeah, well said, because you do get to add context to your activities. So you don't need the fancy title to get extra credit in your activity. Um, and then for everyone, continue to do as well as you can in class. The fact that grade inflation exists is not a reason not to try. In fact, you still want to make sure you have those excellent grades. So with all that said, thanks to everyone who stuck through our presentation, and we will hop over to the Q&A to answer a few questions. Alyssa, we have a question about foreign language. If a student is already taking the fourth level of a foreign language during junior year, do colleges count that as 4 years of a foreign language? Would it be okay for a STEM or engineering student in this situation to take a second AP Science senior year instead of a fifth year of a foreign language?
So in this case, if the student has already exhausted the opportunities that their high school is going to offer for another language, that is something that admissions officers are going to be aware of and take into consideration when a transcript goes out to when a transcript goes out to an admissions officer, it is accompanied by something called a school profile, which details the courses available to a student. So they will know, for instance, no, AP French is as high as it goes. We don't offer, a dual enrollment French 200 or something like that. So in that case, as long as the student is continuing to pursue a course of equivalent rigor, especially for something that is going to be in their major, I don't think that would be counted against them at all.
All right, thank you. Next question. If I know I'm going to major in political science and I'm taking all AP classes except for math, I'm currently in honors and will be in AP Calculus AB next year, my senior year. Then will the fact that I'm only in an honors math class look bad to colleges? And I would say that the answer to that is it will not look bad to colleges. I mean, you will be in AP math by senior year, first of all. So that is a rigorous math curriculum. One thing I'll say is that if we're talking about some of the most selective schools in the country, they explicitly say that they're expecting applicants to have taken the most rigorous course load available to them at their high school. So if your specific concern is admission to one of the very most selective schools in the country, the answer is always like you just have to do the hardest version and you have to get perfect grades anyway. But in all other cases, I mean, taking AP Calculus by senior year for a student who's not actually interested in pursuing STEM in any way in college, that is a rigorous math curriculum, and that is generally going to reflect quite well on you in the admissions process. Um, Another question, what factors should a student consider when choosing between honing in on the SAT or the ACT? So there's one very obvious one, which is which of the two tests can you score higher on? And so the best thing to do is to try a practice version of both tests. Most students have taken the PSAT recently in the month of October, or will take it later this month. That will offer you an SAT benchmark. I'm posting in the chat here what is called a concordance table. This table compares SAT and ACT scores. So if you have that PSAT score, you can take a practice ACT and then compare the score from that ACT to your PSAT. If there's a big head start on one of the other tests, just take the head start and run with it. The other factors, I can't really enumerate what would cause a student to do better on one test or the other for the SAT or ACT because it is a very complicated thing. But what I will say is we do free diagnostic evaluations for any student, meaning I can email you at practice ACT. Your student can take it at home. We can compare that to their PSAT and then use that for us to look at those scores, how your student scored on different areas of the test, and determine what we think is the better path forward for that student based on that. We do that kind of evaluation for free for anyone, and we offer a free planning call afterwards, 15 minutes with me to talk about the recommendation and why and what a test prep plan would look like. So I don't want to just sit here and talk about what could make a student better on one test or the other, because Alyssa knows we would be here until like midnight if I did. But let's have it as a more specific conversation. Email us at my info@myivexperience.com. Ask for an ACT diagnostic test. We will send it to you tomorrow morning, and then we'll be able to evaluate your student's performance relative to their PSAT and give a specific recommendation. All right, can you further qualify the dual enrollment preference? I'm not aware that high school students can actually take a college-led course at the college. Is this what you meant? That is what I meant. It's not an option that's available at every college. But generally speaking, when a course is offered at a high school under the name of dual enrollment, and it's something you can get college credit for, that tends to be less well regarded by colleges than a student taking a college course at a college, whether that's dual enrollment or just taking algebra at the community college over the summer or something like that. So that is what I'm talking about. Taking a course at a college is not always an option for high school students. I want to be clear about that. But where it is, it's preferred. Looks like we have another in the Q&A. Do you think that a passion project or research project looks better to colleges? And what is the best way to begin research? Alyssa, I'll hand that one to you.
So in some ways, I want to challenge the distinction there and go, I would hope that if you are doing research, it is because your research is also your passion. But in this case, as I had said, there is not going to be a specific checklist that colleges are looking for. A student should pursue the things that catch their interest and fuel their passions. If that is something STEM oriented, if you at one point went, why does the water in this particular water fountain taste terrible? And you want to figure that out and you buy a water testing kit and that's something that interests you, amazing. There will be other students who find that to be really, really boring. And I will freely admit there's a reason I do the essay work. Um, but for students who are interested in pursuing research, there are almost infinite options. There are, of course, summer programs, but you can also put together your resume, cold email professors at institutions near you, colleges and universities, and go, hey, would you like free labor over the course of the summer? Trust me, there is a lot of work that goes into producing research projects that professors would be happy to have willing and free assistance with. You can pursue things on your own. If you are one of the students who is fascinated by water and little bug creatures, you can get a microscope that hooks up to your iPhone where you can photograph things down almost to the bacterial level and see what is living in the water around you. And this is one of the reasons why authenticity can be hard, is that digging into and finding a path that is interesting and compelling to you can in some ways be more difficult than going, well, I'm going to do the summer program.
I didn't have Alyssa talking about microscopic iPhone cameras on my webinar bingo card tonight, but these are the kinds of things you learn about working on a lot of college essays with students.
I just discovered that and it is fascinating.
Yeah. And she says she doesn't like science. All right. So thank you everyone for joining. It looks like we ran through all the questions. If you have questions that are more specific to your student, this is a 15-minute link to book a meeting with me. So feel free to set up a meeting, particularly if you want to talk about a test prep plan or academic tutoring for your student, or if you have just questions about any service we offer, I can answer them. Alyssa can as well. She doesn't have the Calendly link there, but if you email info@myivexperience.com asking for Alyssa, she will get back to you with availability and set up a call.
Yes. And
So
both of our Calendlys are in the chat as well.
excellent. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great night, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Bye bye.